Welcome to the Creative Strings Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Howes. I do have a little bit of a thing in my throat today. Apologize for that, but I'm so delighted to be here with my friend, Ellen Hendriksen, who is a clinical psychologist, a PhD, and a very established, she's a big deal author. And she has a new book that's called How to Be Enough, Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists, which I know is perfect for you if you're a listener in this audience, if you're a musician, if you're a music teacher, if you're someone trying to build your own creative career. She is the real deal. So we're going to get right into it. And I want to thank our sponsor, Electric Violin Shop, for all things electric strings. If you need help, call them. Everything you might want, gear related. Just call them at their phone number during business hours. You'll speak with a human. Ellen, you're a rock star. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
So I had a couple questions I want to ask you about perfectionism. I'm really interested in psychology as a musician. Actually, one of the things, this wasn't a question that you gave me right away, but I know you're going to answer, how does perfectionism apply to musicians? I know this is a big one we're going to talk about in defining perfectionism, but one of the first things that come up to me is, I think a lot of people that follow me or know me, they think, oh, Chris has had a lot of success. Like I've had success as a musician, let's say. And I think of you as being somebody who has a tremendous amount of success also. So my point is, perfectionism doesn't discriminate on whether you're successful or not. Is that true? Could you speak about that?
100%. Yeah, no, I would argue that the high achievers among us are probably the most perfectionistic, because we'll get right into definitions. Perfectionism is the tendency to demand of oneself a level of performance that is higher than required for the situation. Okay. I like to think of that as one of those like optical illusions. You can look at one way or the other way, different things. Like you might see the bunny or the duck or the young lady or the old lady. Perfectionism can be good, like demanding of oneself a level of performance higher than what is required for the situation. That hits it out of the park. That makes the world go round. Like we get high achievement, great performances, really outstanding work out of demanding of ourselves that level of performance. Okay, so good stuff. In fact, at the heart of perfectionism is a really healthy personality trait called conscientiousness. And that is a tendency to be thorough, do things well, be responsible, be dutiful. I like to call it the least sexy superpower. So it's this healthy heart, but it can really quickly tip over into unhealthy perfectionism. And that has, according to the researchers, doctors Ross Shapper and Zephyr Cooper, Christopher Fairburn, from when they were colleagues at Oxford University, it has two pillars. So unhealthy perfectionism, there is self-criticism. So that needs no definition, but in perfectionistic self-criticism, it's particularly harsh and personalistic. But then the other pillar is this thing that was relatively new to me when I was digging through the literature. So it might be new to your listeners. And that's something called over-evaluation. And that is when we start to conflate our performance and our self-worth. So forgive my grammar, but it's when I did good equals I am good, or I did bad equals I am bad. And so that conflation can be about anything. So appropriate to your audience, it could be that we only feel as good as our last performance. Or there, again, it could be anything. Like think of the striver student who defines themselves by their grades, or an employee who sees their quarterly evaluation not only as a referendum on their work, but also on their character. Or the athlete who's only as good as their last game. We can over-evaluate anything, our reflection in the mirror, how healthy we ate today, really anything that we take extremely personally and we use to define ourselves or our worth or our character. So this is a long intro, so I'm not sure if I even answered your question. So definition, and okay, yes, the different areas. Okay, so whatever it is we over-evaluate, that's where we're going to be perfectionistic. So for myself, I'm on the same journey as my readers and as maybe some of your listeners. So I over-evaluate my work, so the work I put out into the world, and also my social behavior. I wrote, my first book was about social anxiety, and I talk about my own history of social anxiety in there. Yeah, but I am definitely not perfectionistic about, for instance, like my wardrobe or like the clutter in my house. Those things I don't identify with as much, but it's whatever we hold dearly to the point of having it be, again, a referendum on our self-worth.
Thank you. And for me, one of the things that comes up is like, whenever I hear somebody who's like an expert like yourself, who's a PhD and research based, talking about perfectionism in clinical terms, I almost get confused, and so I want to just check in about, okay, so perfectionism is when I'm constantly criticizing myself and I feel like whatever I do, it's not good enough. Like I'm not happy with myself. I'm not happy with my performance. And I want to share a story, because I think the first question I asked you was because I realized that there was probably a decade that I was just always beating myself up about whether I was a good enough musician. But the thing is, I won awards and whatever, I'm considered a quote unquote advanced musician, but I never felt like I was good enough. And I heard this story about Alan Holdsworth, who passed away, I think a couple of years ago. I'm not even sure. But Alan Holdsworth is one of the most legendary guitar players. He's one of my idols. And I knew this guy that worked with Alan Holdsworth. And the guy played with Alan on the show. And he would be like, the guy was just genius. He's just spewing genius, constant spewings of genius. And after the gig, he'd go back there and he would just be speechless. He'd be like, Alan, I don't know what to say. You're a genius. And Alan would be like, every note I played was complete shit or something like that. It was just totally. And so the point is, perfectionism can affect us even if we're quote unquote high achieving. And the way it shows up is that we feel like shit. We feel bad about our performance and we associate it with our self-worth. I think, is that all right?
100%. Yeah. I love the phrase spewing of genius. That should be a band or something. Or at least a poetry collection. Yes. Yeah, 100%. I think that perfectionism is actually a little bit of a misnomer because we all think of it I think in pop culture, we think about it as striving to be perfect. Everything has to be perfect. And as a clinical psychologist who specializes in anxiety, that's not what I see in the clinic at all. I'd say the majority of my clients come in with perfectionism at the overlapping Venn diagram, the center of their issues, but nobody comes in and says, I need everything to be perfect. I strive to make things perfect. Instead, they come in and they say, I feel like I'm failing. I feel like I am falling behind. I should be so much farther ahead than I am. I am not reaching my potential. I have a million things on my plate. I'm not doing any of them well. It's always the not good enough. And again, I think that's because perfectionism is a misnomer. It's not about striving to be perfect. It's about never feeling good enough, for sure.
Got you. And you touched on this. Let's say that I'm really perfectionistic I really pay attention to, let's say, my violin intonation. And I feel horrible whenever I play out of tune, but that I might look like crap on camera and I don't care. Or my backdrop looks completely whatever. I don't care about it. I don't care about production values. Why do you already addressed it. You said that we care about the things that we associate with our self-worth, but why do we pick those different things? And how can we use that? Is there any way we can use that?
Use that to
use the fact that I don't care about production values to somehow be let me just feel the same way about my intonation. I don't know. Or that doesn't work.
Sure. Okay. So interestingly, I feel like the over-evaluation is the core of it. And it also comes packaged with a lot of things. And we can that gives us a lot of points of intervention. So the things that the over-evaluation, taking perhaps a mistake in your intonation as, that means I screwed up, that feeling like shit. We, as part of that, focus on flaws and details. So we zero in on the equivalent of the one frowning face in the crowd of smiles. We see the crumbs on the otherwise clean counter that nobody sees. We hear the intonation mistake that nobody else hears, right? So there's a focus on flaws and details. And there's a really all or nothing evaluation. So if we make a mistake, we screw up, we struggle, even if it's only internal and nobody ever knows, that in our mind shifts us from all to nothing. There's a little teeny tiny set of criteria for success and a huge gulf for failure. So for instance, in other examples, eating a cookie ruins our healthy eating for the day, or losing our temper once with our kids makes us a bad parent. In your example, maybe the intonation, if that's the mistake, quote unquote, that happened, perhaps that if we set the bar for adequate at flawless, and then we make a mistake, that's going to shunt us from all to nothing. So comes packaged with a lot of stuff. But again, that creates a lot of points for intervention. We can nibble away at the over-evaluation. We can address the self-criticism. We can try to move from all or nothing to both and. And so whatever you'd like to talk about, we can look at those.
Yeah, well, no, just quickly on that. One of the things that I have suggested to many of my students is that they evaluate their work by recording themselves, first of all. For all of you out there listening, you've heard me say this. If you haven't, you need to listen to more of these podcasts. But I say like the best way to grow is to record yourself. And I would assume that the same thing would be true of a clinical psychologist, because you can get immediate feedback that you will recognize and be able to parse. If you videotape yourself giving any of your clients a session, you'll immediately see it because you have a vantage point when you're watching from outside of the event. But when I tell my students to record and listen back, I suggest that they make a very detailed, specific list of criteria. It's intonation, rhythm, articulation, for example, right? But then you have to keep an actual score, because the tendency is just to say, oh, I suck, I play out of tune, which is what you said, all or nothing. But if you notice that there was 150 notes you played and 3 of them were out of tune, and there was these notes and they were flat, then you can actually have some objective measure of saying, I played 3 notes out of tune. So is that something backed up in your research or not?
No, 100%. Yeah, you're way ahead of me, because the way to get away from the over-evaluation is to focus on the work, to go from this kind of global evaluation to like specific information. So in the book, for instance, I tell this story about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and his time at UCLA with the legendary basketball coach John Wooden. And the UCLA franchise had such success under Coach Wooden that researchers wanted to know, like, how does he do this? What is the secret sauce? And so these 2 education researchers, doctors Roland Tharp and Ronald Gallimore, sat in the stands for every practice of the 1974-75 season to see what he did. And what they discovered is that he very seldom praised or rebuked his players. Instead, what he did as a former high school teacher, he taught. He did just that. He taught. And so he would give you information. And so instead of things like, good job, or that sucked, he would say things like, pass from the chest, take lots of shots where you might get them in games, pass the ball to someone short. He would give you very specific instructions. It was focused on the work. And so we can take a page from that philosophy by taking the stance of a sculptor eyeing a block of marble and saying, okay, what would make this thing better? What would be better for the work? And so what you're telling your students to do is exactly that, is to listen for specific things within the work. It's not some kind of like overall evaluation that reflects on them. Like, am I good enough or do I suck? It's let's listen to the notes. Let's listen to the technical aspects or the musicality or the intonation, whatever they're listening for. But it's that healthy perspective about the work. So absolutely. Good job from the perfectionism perspective.
I love that. I love that. And again, just briefly, I want to tell people, make sure you get the book, How to Be Enough, Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists by Ellen Hendriksen. The spelling is Hendriksen, Hendriksen. So it's Hendriksen with a K and 2 E's. The actual question I was going to start with, which is, how does perfectionism apply to musicians?
Yeah, for sure. I think we can apply a little bit of what we've talked about already there. Like, I think the over-evaluation, for sure. It's very easy to feel only as good as our last performance or even our last practice. Like, even if no one except us hears it, if we over-evaluate our performance and our character, that there we are. I think it can also apply because, so perfectionism is known as a personality profile. Like, we hear perfectionist and we think of folks like Steve Jobs or Serena Williams or Hermione Granger, but perfectionism certainly can be a personality profile. It can come from within. There's even evidence that it is heritable and genetic, but recent research has shown that it also comes from all around us. It comes from a larger culture. And this is based in the fact that every human reacts to the situations they're put in. And so if we're put into a climate where there is no room for error, that we get harshly punished if we do make a mistake or step out of line, where we are only as valuable as our performance, then of course we're going to respond with perfectionism. So I think in some forms of music, I think it's hard to be a perfectionist because there is room for error. I interviewed a child prodigy violinist for the book, and her environment was 100% a perfectionistic climate. But she talked about a friend who learned to improv, and she said there, one wrong note by itself might be a mistake, but deliberately repeated, it could become part of a pattern or a theme. So I think some areas of music are definitely perfectionistic climates, but others, it's much more forgiving or open. So I think it depends on what situation you're in, because of course you're going to respond to it in that way.
We were talking about this the other day. I would push back on that because I would think, first of all, I'm going to push back on that observation because I think people might be surprised at how much of a climate of perfectionism there is in jazz or folk music or any creative culture, even where if you're not a part of that, you might think, oh yeah, they're improvising, so anything works. But that's misunderstanding what's happening. And it's also misunderstanding the culture that could be in those communities and the pressure that people could be feeling. But I'm not trying to paint what you said as being totally wrong, because I think there can be definitely some ways to work within that.
What she meant by that was that, so she'd been brought up in this, she literally had a teacher who said, you must be perfect at all times. Nobody cares if you're sad or tired, if your dog just died. And then she said, I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to go to fiddle camp. And there were jam sessions in the hallways and like improv all day long. And she hated it because she felt like she was suddenly bad at something that she had given up her childhood to be good at, which was violin. And so I can 100% see what you're saying in terms of you can find a perfectionistic climate anywhere. And I think for her, she went into this climate that was supposedly freeing, and she expected herself to feel like there were fewer restraints or fewer, less rigid expectations. And she felt like she brought it with her, even in a climate that was very different than the one she was using.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because that's like the situation I find myself in every day with classical musicians who they want to branch out into other forms of music making. And I would actually say that part of the reason that it's so hard for them has to do with something else, which is the fact that they're just entering a new discipline at which they're a novice, and they're putting a pressure on themselves, or this expectation, this assumption that it should be easy for them, or that if they have this magic gene. And so it would be like if we took you out of the realm of clinical psychology and said, let's put you in a room with a bunch of, shamans, or
have me start treating schizophrenia or something. I have no idea how to recognize it.
But you just have this very loose idea that it's a more intuitive or free,
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Discipline. But then you get in there and you're like, wait, but there's all these things I've never learned about. And so I have to start from the beginning. And so I see that all the time. And that was what I experienced when I crossed over into different disciplines. But so I'm glad you brought it up, because I think, like even my example of Alan Holdsworth is like amazing jazz musician, a creative musician who he was writing his own music, but he was still having that same level of self-criticism that anybody could experience in the classical world. But you had given the example the other day about culture, like in reference to gymnasts.
Yeah, no, we often think of, perfectionistic cultures as like what we were talking about in terms of the highest levels of classical auditions, the highest levels of women's gymnastics, or the things we think of as these very demanding, no room for error fields. But I think honestly that our overall culture is becoming more and more demanding. There was some really interesting work done by Drs. Thomas Curran and Andrew Hill, and they looked at 27 years of data and found that over time, all three kinds of perfectionism are increasing. So one is self-oriented perfectionism, and that's what we're talking about. So the kind of the classic idea you have when you think about perfectionism. But then there's two other kinds. There's other-oriented perfectionism, and that's when we're hard on others. We expect others to be perfect. And then there's socially prescribed perfectionism. And that's when we assume that others will be hard on us, that others are going to be more demanding and criticizing of our own performance. And so all of those things have been on the rise over their 27 years of data. And the inflection point was 2005, which I think is, correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think it's no surprise. That's when Facebook came out. And so the social media platforms that have followed, I think, have really amplified something in our culture, and it continues to rise even now.
Before we get into like, how can we fix it or change it or whatever for ourselves, I wondered if you'd be willing to just in a little bit on how this could apply for different subsets of my audience, which is not just, there's amateur musicians, there's professional like musicians, and then there's teachers. And then there's, I would say, people who are driving their own careers, who are focused on getting work and getting clients. And I'm interested in like examples of where any of these different people could see. And especially like when I think about teachers, I think a lot of times teachers, I'm a teacher and I feel like I had to recognize that I'm vulnerable as a teacher to it affecting the quality of my teaching, like being perfectionist. I would assume the same is true for you as a counselor or a clinical psychologist if you have clients, and maybe that a lot of teachers would be blind to that. But also just examples for those different subsets. The difference between an amateur who's going to be perfectionistic, a professional player who's going to be a perfection teacher, and someone who's trying to build their business but being held back in various ways, doing marketing, for example, which we both know about. Yeah, so I'll leave that in your lap. And then if you want to address that, then maybe we can go into the final topic after that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think I can give some tips for each group you mentioned, but there's a lot of Venn diagram overlap there. So I would say for amateurs, the permission to make mistakes is different than what I think the traditional advice around perfectionism is. Usually we hear, you need to lower your standards, or you need to stop when things are good enough. And if you ever told somebody with perfectionism to do that, you're going to get a look that is equivalent to if you had just suggested they pull out their toenails. Because if we are over-evaluating and we are like over-identifying with our performance, then of course we're not going to accept subpar or mediocre outcomes, because that means we're subpar or mediocre. And so I think to tell amateurs or students who are working really hard to get better, to refrain from saying stop when things are good enough or lower your standards, but instead to encourage room for error. That sometimes I will tell the psychology grad students that I mentor or supervise, it's okay to have a session that doesn't go well, or to not know what to do, or to even make a mistake. Then you then have to repair the next session because you're a student. This is why we don't license you right away. Like, it makes sense that if you're making mistakes and trying new things and testing stuff out and trying to build your own, in the case of my students, style, or like in the case of your students, like maybe it's style in a different way, and it doesn't go well sometimes, that means you're doing it right. That's what being a student is. And we can even apply making room for mistakes to the folks who are experts, to the people who are have been doing this for a long time. So for example, I had a client who we will call Julie, and she's a doctor. She's a pediatrician. And she had a patient come in with some abdominal pain, and Julie diagnosed it just as constipation, sent her home. And it turned out it was appendicitis. She had missed this big diagnosis, and the patient ended up having to go to the emergency room. Everything was fine, but she came into our session the next week and she was just beating herself up. And she was saying things like, I am a terrible doctor. I should have my head examined. Maybe I should study for the licensing exam again. I can't believe I did that. It was really hard on herself. And we talked about, even after 25 years of practice, what percentage of mistakes or misdiagnoses would be reasonable for her to expect of even like a colleague, like to get some perspective and say, somebody in your situation, what percentage of mistakes would you expect them to make? And the answer can't be zero. We have to give ourselves some kind of non-zero quota of mistakes to occur over the course of a career, even when we feel like that we're beyond mistakes or those shouldn't be happening anymore. We are human. And so, of course, we're going to have some error. Okay. Anyway, that's a very long way of pulling apart. Don't lower your standards. Please keep your high standards. That is going to get you really far. So keep your high standards, but also make room for some inevitable blips and bloops because you're a human being. That's one. Another thing is, I think with teachers, I think oftentimes in teaching, and I can relate to this, and I see it also in colleagues, in other professors, we do something called perfectionistic self-presentation, where if we're in charge or we're theoretically know what we're doing or we're very experienced, then we might have a tendency to only show what's going well and to hide what's going poorly. So to pretend that we've got it all together and not share that we still struggle or have things to learn or don't know things. And so when we do that perfectionistic self-presentation, it can come across as a very either superhuman or impressive or unrelatable situation, which may in some situations be appropriate to have this hierarchical relationship. But when we do the opposite and we show our students some of the mess or say, yeah, I had this session that totally went off the rails the other day, or I didn't know what to do when this person said this. What's your advice to me? Then we send two messages. One is we send the message, we are equal. I still have stuff to learn. You still have stuff to learn. We're on this journey together. And the second message we send is, I trust you to see some of the mess. I trust you to see all of me, not just the stuff that is going well. So I would encourage teachers you are the expert there. You're not going to go overboard with your students in terms of being vulnerable or needing them to teach you. But I think showing a little bit of the mess, a little bit of the struggle will show teachers as human and as someone who's on the same journey as their students.
I wonder if I could ask into that just really briefly, because this is the story of my whole life and career, is trying to encourage a lot of teachers to go into the next frontier of music education. But I think that a lot of them don't have the training in that. And so it's scary. And because they're like, how am I going to teach it if I don't know it? And there could be so much fear in, and I wonder, I guess you might have already thought about this as it could be a global thing. So it's like you're a clinical psychologist who was trained 20 years ago. And while you keep up with your training, surely there's like new trends that are like,
oh yeah, for sure.
And so how do you, is that a thing? Is what I'm saying. Is that a thing for teachers where they might feel scared to keep up with or try to teach into new trends that they weren't trained before?
Yeah, because if as a teacher or as an expert, you're supposed to know what you're doing, starting someplace new puts you in this very unfamiliar place where you feel vulnerable or you feel like a beginner or you feel like incompetent. If you're used to feeling competent, it can be really hard to feel incompetent all of a sudden. And that can be something that's hard to tolerate for sure. So yeah, no, you're definitely onto something. And I think that that's the package deal that we get with being teachers, and that feeling like an expert and feeling competent. But if we're doing it correctly or like keeping up with either for me, like the literature or the techniques, or for you, the teaching styles or whatever's coming up in music, same. Yeah. I think that the package deal is we're going to feel, by and large, competent with this kind of piggyback of some incompetence. And that those are going to come bundled together. And that's okay. That's how it works. I think, especially if we're following our values, if we're following the values of being the best teacher we can be, or being informed, or learning, or keeping up with the field, then I think that is naturally going to come bundled with some negative emotion, whether that's like, feeling incompetent, feeling incapable, maybe feeling guilty that we hadn't done this earlier, feeling worried that someone's going to see that we don't know what we're doing. For sure. It's all the part of the package deal of doing what we do.
And what comes up for me is that it might hold us back from moving forward in our own growth as well, might stop us from taking a training or trying something new because it's just like too confronting or whatever. I don't know. I want to respect your time. I want to make sure that we can maybe move on to some of the final question. And before we do get into that, and thanks for giving me extra time already. It's like a masterclass every time I have a conversation with you. And I'm really grateful to consider you a friend and like that you're willing to share with my audience. Again, reminder to everybody, this is Al Hendriksen and her new book, which is How to Be Enough, Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists. Go get it. Get that book. She's an established author, a PhD, a clinical psychologist. You can go to ellenhendriksen.com. If you probably Google Ellen Hendriksen psychologist, I'm guessing it'll come up if you don't know how to spell her name, but it has a K and 2 E's. She also has Substack, How to Be Good to Yourself When You're Hard on Yourself. So the final question, and I'll just let you riff on it, and so you can get out of here, is either how do we lessen self-criticism or beating ourselves up? And obviously everybody get the book, and or you already said we don't necessarily need to lower our standards to overcome perfectionism. So then how can we lessen self-criticism or lessen beating ourselves up?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to answer your question in a way that sounds counterintuitive. I have two levers. We each have two levers available to us. We have change and we have acceptance. So we can absolutely try to change our self-criticism. We can try to change how we talk to ourselves, to try to be more self-compassionate. And there we can, to try to pack this in, self-compassion doesn't have to be words. I was taught that self-compassion was talking to yourself like a good friend. And for my perfectionistic brain, I thought that meant I had to feed myself this like steady stream of self-compassionate hype. And that was way too high a bar. So what's way easier is that self-compassion can be actions. So self-compassion can be, it doesn't even have to be related to our performance at hand. It can simply be treating ourselves as someone who is deserving of kindness. We could give ourselves a few more minutes to drink our coffee in the morning. We could go to the gym because we know from experience that makes us feel good. Or, this is important for people with perfectionism, we could, to be kind to ourselves, skip going to the gym because we are already exhausted and have 3 other things we need to do tonight. So self-compassion, way easier than the self-compassion speech writing that I was trying to do, is to treat ourselves well, to do self-compassionate behaviors, which could include letting ourselves off the hook and not doing all that we expect of ourselves. So that's change. That's pulling the lever of change. We're doing something differently. But I think for self-criticism, pulling that lever of acceptance is, at least for me, was even more powerful. So because conscientiousness is at the heart of perfectionism, inherent in that means we take things seriously. Like I take my work seriously. Your listeners take their music very seriously. Okay. But that same conscientiousness often means that we take our thoughts and our feelings very seriously. And so what we can try to do is to take those self-critical thoughts less seriously, less literally. They're still going to happen. Like in your example, the jazz pianist is after a performance is probably still, his brain is just gonna create those thoughts that I sounded like shit. But what we can do is take the stance towards those thoughts that we would like we're listening to the music in a coffee shop. It's there. We can hear it, but we don't have to dance along. We don't have to take it super literally and, sing along with it. So for me, I really try to live by the book's subtitle, Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists. And so when my self-critical brain starts going, which at least for me, after anything involving a microphone, or like putting my work out into the world, I know my brain is going to give me thoughts that like, this is bad, or this wasn't good enough, or I could have done some like things differently. Why did I say it that way? And I know that's just what my brain does. That's just how I'm wired. And so I can let them play out and let these thoughts go by, sushi at a revolving restaurant, but I don't have to pick it up. I don't have to get tangled in it. That is a technique called cognitive diffusion. We diffuse ourselves from our thoughts. And this is a quick riff. A fan favorite way to do that is to play with the thoughts and make them a little bit irreverent or a little bit like ridiculous in order, again, not to change them, but to emphasize that they are thoughts. So for instance, I have a client who he will imagine Animal from the Muppets, like beating on his drum set and yelling his thought, which is, everyone will judge you. And then I have another client who her thought is, you're going to let everyone down. And so she has composed a little song. And whenever this thought pops in her head, she'll sing it. She'll just sing along to the tune she made up. And again, The thought's still there. It's not going away. Our brains are going to make these thoughts, but we can emphasize the fact that they're just thoughts. They're not facts. They're not reality. They're not truth, and therefore take them less seriously and less literally.
Spewing genius, Ellen Hendriksen. I want to say, everybody, for you, I want to say for you, Ellen, that having you as someone who I consider a friend and that I'm grateful or fortunate to occasionally have conversations with is incredibly encouraging to me in my own struggle with perfectionism or beating myself up, because I see, wow, she's spewing genius and she also struggles with this. And I want to tell everybody that's listening, I have done a lot of just general work on putting time and attention into my mental health, for lack of flowery words to talk about it, my emotional health and stuff like this. And it's made a huge difference in my life. My life is better. I still have a lot of work to do, but all this stuff that Ellen is sharing, this is a practice that you get to engage in every day. And I think probably one of the easiest ways to do that is to reserve your copy of How to Be Enough, Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists. Just go out and buy it. And you put that book on your table and you read a little bit of it every day if it reminds you to do a little something, because she's going to have a bunch of stuff in there that's going to help you. But the larger theme, it's so important for all of us as musicians, as creatives, as parents, in relationships, in marriages, and just in our relationship to ourselves. And I'm just so grateful to have people like you, Ellen, in my life that remind me of that and help me with that. So thank you. And a word to our sponsor, again, Electric Violin Shop, all things electric strings, gear, whatever it might be, whatever your questions are. You always ask me gear questions. Call Electric Violin Shop, their website, electricviolinshop.com. Speak to a human. They will answer all your questions. Ellen, thanks again. Thanks for going overtime with me. You're a rock star. You're a freaking powerhouse of love.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I love talking with you. I'm so grateful for your friendship, and thank you for your support and letting me be helpful to your listeners.